And I'd also like to shout out to Amir, wave your hand, who's one of my co-PIs on this project. So anything that's great, you ask me about. Anything that's not, ask him. All right, so in an attempt to begin this presentation in media res, I'm going to actually ask you a question.
Always crowdsourcing your work.
Oh yeah, no, I don't do any actual work myself. Can you detect the lie? So on YouTube, a bunch of teenagers went out, played a two truths and a lie game. I've extracted here one of the videos with one truth and one lie. I'm going to play them for you, and then we're going to see how good you are at figuring out which one's which. All right, get ready for an intense injection of teenage angst. Here we go. Here's one claim.
I broke my hand beating someone up because I punched him so many times in the face.
Okay. Number two.
I've stolen things from the store.
All right. If you think the left video is the lie, raise your hand. If you think the right video is the lie, raise your hand. Okay, so we got about 2/3, 1/3. This is what we got. So the 1/3 had it. Turns out people are pretty poor at detecting deception. There's a large literature about this, and seems adaptive, right? If we were actually good at detecting deception, then we wouldn't actually lie. But what's interesting to me about this is that this is something that people in aggregate can do much better. Not simply by taking votes, but by being a little bit smarter about this. People are extremely good at doing what's called analogical reasoning, understanding essentially features that might be informative about a question. But they're very poor in general at weighing the evidence to make a final decision. So what we can start to do is go out, ask people on the internet, show them the two videos and say, tell us something that differs between these two videos. We then get a bunch of folks on the internet, again through a platform like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, a microtasking platform, to label these features, but then use machine learning to actually figure out how to weigh this evidence. When we do so, what we can do is identify features like short sentences and few details that allow a combined system to actually label this thing correctly, where the people themselves really don't do so much better than chance at all. In fact, we're about 10% more accurate than human reasoning, which is about a 300% relative improvement. This is just one piece of, one example of the kind of thing that we're interested in this Mapping the Social Genome project. At the highest level, our group is interested in recognizing fundamental human behavior patterns from their digital traces. This goes by many different terms. Some of you might call it computational social science. We think of it rather holistically from multiple different levels. We're interested in both static and dynamic processes, things that don't change like my personality, and things that do like my emotions. But then we're also interested in cascading through multiple different levels of society, all the way down at the individual level, through groups up to the entire society at once. And what I'm going to attempt to do today is give you a bit of a tour through several of these ideas, and then do a deeper dive into one of them. So I just told you a little bit about the kinds of work we're interested in doing at the individual level, allowing individuals to make smarter decisions. But let me dive for a minute into the group level. This is if you're interested in this, I definitely would encourage you to talk to Amir. So group culture is really essential to human experience. And if there's anything that is going to be a theme in today's presentation, it's going to be about how these sort of data science principles play out and can be used to improve organizations. So let's talk about an organization for a minute. Cultural fit is an incredibly important aspect of success for an organization. Businesses try to establish really strong cultures so that these more top-down oversight mechanisms don't become as necessary. And the way you usually measure a culture is through a survey, but this has all sorts of really problematic biases about it. So what our group has been doing has been looking at linguistic alignment. So everyday language use. And these patterns require big data to really get at. They're subtle. They're not the kinds of things that you, like lying, that you could pay attention to normally. So what we've gotten is about 10 million email languages, email messages, which is essentially comprehensive for a mid-sized tech firm. They then calculated KL divergence between essentially my language model and the organization's writ large. which allows us to understand how well linguistically I'm aligned with my colleagues. As we can do that, we can try to predict all sorts of attainments. Right? For example, well, here's not some great news. Involuntary exit, which is a nice term for you're fired. Turns out that if you have low cultural fit linguistically, if my language does not align with that of the firm, I have an incredibly high risk of getting fired rather quickly. Controlling for other features, incredible that essentially just language can predict something up to about a 0.45 probability that you're going to end up exiting the firm involuntarily. You notice that all you need to do, I'm not sure this is optimistic, but if you just start to talk a little bit more like everyone else, no causation implied here, but right, those who do seem to survive much longer. So again, what's interesting to me about this is that this is not something that's consciously available to us. And it's probably not something we're consciously making decisions on, but it is an extremely strong effect. And you can see similar patterns when you're talking not about exit, but also about promotion. So let's talk one level even higher about society. And I think when we talk about society, we're talking about things that really play out at huge emergent scales. Here's a project that was done by my PhD student, Justin Chang, along with Yuri Leskovic. So a question you might have is whether we should feed trolls. Every organization has people who are trollish. Online communities are no different. When people act out, what should you do? Right? I have a toddler. Do you like ignore it when they're acting out, or do you punish them? Do you try to be nice? What do you do? So what our group acquired was a really, really large data set of comment and upvote behavior from 4 large online news communities, all using the discussion platform. And what they looked for were people's comments, whether they got upvoted or downvoted, essentially, and then what happened to their future behavior. So you can imagine that I make a comment that gets upvoted, I get all this positive reinforcement, I become an even better citizen, virtuous cycle. You can also imagine I get upvoted and it doesn't matter. On the other hand, maybe when I get downvoted, maybe that helps correct me, right? I realize that I'm out of line and then I get better. Here's what we find. Let's say that we have 2 people who have similar history. One of them makes a post that gets positively evaluated, the other one gets negatively evaluated. If you get positively evaluated, turns out nothing happens. You just expect it, right? Okay, so your later quality and perception is about the same. However, if you get negatively evaluated, what happens is that your future posts then start being perceived worse and are actually, in terms of language, worse themselves. So simply by punishing a bad post, you are creating a troll. That's pretty scary as the designer of an online environment, right? If you are simply trying to tell people they're not right, you're just encouraging more of the same behavior. So let's pop out from trolls to something that courses even more through our society, death. I would claim that really death shapes many matters of our society. And in fact, there are many other behaviors besides death that produce similar responses. When people are upset, let's say a launch goes poorly or something like this. What our team has done is collected about 500,000 news articles every day since 2008 and paid attention to essentially obituaries, to when people die. We use that as a point when something of interest occurs, the death, and we look at someone's popularity before that and after that. And what we see are several different kinds of patterns. In one case, let's take Whitney Houston in the upper left, you have someone who was already pretty popular, received much more attention after her tragic and somewhat unexpected death, and then actually retained it. So she ended up being more popular after her death than before.
What is the vertical axis?
The vertical axis, if I read it here, is the fraction of the documents in the corpus on a log scale that are about that person. So you can see that this fraction actually goes up by about an order of magnitude after her death. You can also see someone like Richard Holbrooke, who's a diplomat and an author, who's sort of on the contrary actually experiencing a decline after his death by, again, about an order of magnitude. And then you have Kashiram Rana, who's a politician, was mentioned only rarely beforehand, and then had a short peak with his passing, and then regressed to his pre-mortem mean, which is in many ways the fate of most. These really represent, these are exemplars of large clusters that are predictable from a mix of this individual attributes and data and how people recovered in their death. So again, you can imagine similar kinds of patterns occur with other kinds of events that cause large cultural reactions. So that's a quick survey. I'd like to talk more, I'll go a little bit deeper into some of the work that my own group has been doing at the group level. And one of the reasons that this is interesting to me is that for a long time, the computer has essentially been the thing that that we use to go do our work. So we get work from our bosses, from the rest of our organization. We turn to Excel, we turn to our spreadsheet, we turn to our database, and we do it. But what started to happen is that we are now connecting to our work through the internet. So we have platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, crowdsourcing platforms, and much more, Upwork, Gigwork, Uber, that are starting to point toward this world where the computer is actually connecting me to what I'm trying to do. It's telling me what to do, when to be there. And it turns out that something on the order of 20% of United States jobs could eventually be sent down the wire and become, in a sense, what we might call crowd work. That's about 45 million full-time jobs. So far, all that the computer has done with us is allowed us to chat. And that's pretty powerful. We can create things like Wikipedia. But we also know that when we're just chatting, we do all sorts of things incorrectly. There's a litany of sad literature in the organizational behavior world talking about all the ways in which we sort of naively would apply heuristics about how we organize, not doing very well when we actually try to pull it. All this is to say, when we try to get something done, we're not very good at it. But I wonder, could we use computation and data to turn from a notion where we're just on our own to something that helps us organize our efforts? Could computing actually connect large groups of people within our organizations or looking outside to these on-demand crowds to tackle bigger and harder problems than we could in isolation? So you may already know of this term called crowdsourcing, where you'll take these small tasks and pass them outside of your firm, get them done in small little chunks. And this works really great for things that can be subdivided. But for really, really large tasks, things like design, engineering, wicked problems like this, doesn't work so well. But I want to ask, could we in fact actually tackle some of these problems? Could we crowdsource the entire design process, starting on one hand from a napkin sketch you drew out while you're listening to me, and have 24 hours from now a working user-tested software prototype that you can show? And one of the things that we're starting to do is to shift this perspective from getting data out of the crowd only to getting actual expertise, going from just microtasks to programmers, designers, editors, and more. And what we've been working on is something called Flash Teams that allows us to do this. It's a computational infrastructure that pulls together experts of varying areas and connects them through the internet to tackle these short sprints. So you might imagine at the very lowest level, it's just a workflow. You know you have a low-fidelity mock-up that a UI designer can make. You want to get a high-fidelity prototype that a developer could create, and you're just trying to create a path between these two. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that if we're putting a computer in the middle, it can actually represent what you're trying to accomplish. And if it can represent it, then it can help you attain it. So imagine that now all of a sudden, these teams can be modular. So if I can have one, I can have three. I can hire more people out of the crowd and on demand create more teams to help get more of this done. These teams can take different inputs and produce different outputs. I have different napkin sketches, I get different prototypes. I can also connect these teams like Lego blocks to create larger macro scale organizations. So I can create multiple design teams, connect them to animation and education and an ebook, and create an organization that didn't exist yesterday, will not exist tomorrow, but for this afternoon is creating something incredible. We can also take advantage of some traditional computer science techniques like elasticity. So instead of having three people always, why not have one by default and allow the team to grow and shrink on demand as needed? So this allows us to grow based on whether we need extra workers to help to complete the job on time, or hire someone out of the crowd right as we need them with a specialized skill, like someone who's a logo designer, for example, if we need that. We can also take advantage of pipelining, right? A traditional pipeline workflow would look like this. I create my low-fidelity mockups, I get an expert evaluation, I return it for a revised mockups, I turn it over to development, we take a user study and go back and forth like this. But of course, I don't have to wait for your entire website before I can tell you what's wrong with it. As soon as you produce something, I can start to stream in progress output. And if we start to get these kinds of annotations, the system can automatically start to compress these teams and start things as soon as it's possible to begin. One of the most unusual and exotic things that comes out of this is creation by request. I've told you that these teams can be modular, so if you have a napkin sketch that you want to produce an output for, that's great, I can create that, but maybe you don't want a software prototype, maybe you want an animation. And we may not have one of those blocks in our Lego kit, but we may have little pieces of previous tasks that can, through these inputs and outputs that are structured, be wired together to create a synthetic team that's never before existed, may never come back again, but does exactly what you need. And it turns out we can do this in a relatively straightforward way by converting these teams into an action planning language, which the AI community has done for many years, and for most practical problems solve quite efficiently. Now, this is in a sense a new form of work. There are many project management platforms out there, but they don't really capitalize on the unique affordances of like crowds and data and scale. So we've been starting to build our own called Foundry, where we can start to actually take advantage of this. We can author these teams, we can track progress, we can log everything that's happening. So what you would start to do is create a workflow that looks like this in Foundry. When you're ready, you start the team. We hire folks on demand out of the crowd to tackle each piece. And you can start to see some tasks are completed, others are in progress. If they're late, we update everyone. In a sense, we try to take care of all the management scut work that happens with distributed teams. And what you start to see is that when you run these Flash teams on various inputs, these are actually taken from my undergraduate class, something that takes about 10 weeks on average. In about a day, and at about $1,000, we're creating these user-tested revised prototypes, something that maybe you don't want to put on the App Store tomorrow, but is far enough to get feedback from your teammates. In fact, we can do more than just engineering. We can pull together teams that can do things like creative work. So here's a scaffold for a Flash team that creates an animation from a script. In this case, my colleague, or our colleague, Terry Winograd, had retired, and we wanted a Flash team to make a video celebrating his retirement, basically with an event that when he built a computer in his garage growing up. So here's the video that they made in about 45 hours, $2,300, and 4 people, all sourced on demand from the crowd on Upwork.
It's the future! It works!
I await my Emmy. We can even combine these kinds of groups, like I mentioned, like Lego blocks, into a macro scale organization. So imagine being able to complement your internal organization with these sort of on-demand organizations where we can compose multiple of these teams together. So we can take multiple design teams and education teams where we combine someone who has curricular development experience with a topic expertise with an animation team and create this sort of macro scale effort. In this case, we were interested in trying to compete with my colleagues Andrew Daphne, who are creating and Sebastian, who are creating on-demand MOOCs, essentially. And I said, well, I don't want actually useful content. I want things that is completely useless. So things like how to sing from the diaphragm, how to take portrait photography, although Hector would probably disagree that that's useless, and how to solve the Towers of Hanoi problem, which I think many people in this room would disagree is useless. So maybe it's not actually useless. So these teams created about 1.5 minute long videos, again in about 1 day on demand. These folks had never met before, may never meet again, but they were scaffolded through the Flash Streams process to produce something that was actually a reasonable platform and set of questions and videos. In fact, when we run experiments on this, we find compared to teams that are essentially war rooming, hired out of the crowd and allowed to take their own process and work on it, these Flash teams take 50% as much time. And this is in many ways just because we can take advantage of years of research in organizational behavior to understand how to best get these folks to collaborate. And I'll talk in a moment about how data is empowering this even more moving forward. I do want to mention that in part this work has been funded by one of the folks who are here in SDSI, which is Accenture. They in fact ran a few of their own teams internally last spring. And what you can see here are a couple different things that they created. You can speak to Alex Cass there in the back if you're interested in hearing more, where at Accenture they created an internal animated marketing video, a simple mobile application. And for me what was something I'm not great at measuring, but they're much better at, was understanding whether this is up to corporate standards and how much it would cost relatively. And what they told me was that it took something like 1/8 to 1/6 1/6 the cost of an agency estimate of how much it would do for equivalent quality. Moving forward, I think what everyone in this group is interested in doing is understanding whether you can gather data about organizations, about teams, run experiments on platforms like this to answer questions like, who should be put together on a team, right? What kinds of tasks are certain collaborators good at? What kinds of collaborations tend to succeed? This is something that's been largely invisible to us, even with many modern organizations. But with platforms like this, we can actually start to experiment and understand far better what kinds of opportunities are there. So zooming out at the highest level, what our team has been interested in doing is understanding, in many ways, what we call the social genome, right? How does society work? How do we work? Getting, in many ways, an unprecedented microscope onto how we think, or how we collectively think, or how I'm influenced by how you think, and using that to design better organizations, better online communities, and better tools for you and I. I just want to close by mentioning, again, that I don't think much of this work is incredibly interdisciplinary and could not happen without having colleagues around the School of Education, the Graduate School of Business, Computer Science, Linguistics, all over. So we're all very happy to talk to you. You got a very computer science-centric point of view on today's talk, but there are many of us who are happy to engage with you and would love to chat more. So I will halt here and we can chat more. I'll invite Amir up for any questions as well.
Let's get some questions. Pantosh, the microphone is right behind you.
Hi, nice talk. So I was wondering if you find differences within large companies about functions or organizations that have a propensity to organize in Upwork and Flash teams. So do younger teams or newer teams show more tendency to organize this way, and teams that are well set don't want to be disturbed, or what is the uptake of the things that you're proposing?
That's a great question. Something we're we're basically just starting an investigation with, actually in collaboration with Accenture, is thinking about these sort of hybrids, right? What happens when you have the boundary between a traditional firm, right, which like in a Cosean sense basically exists because it's more efficient to do it internally, and something like the crowd, where now all of a sudden this cost of reaching out to people who you may not have traditionally had within your firm goes to near zero. And I think one of the biggest challenges in many ways is actually onboarding, right? How do you pull people from 0 to 60? People who have a no, in a mere sense, no cultural fit with your organization. You need to essentially go from people who may have worked on a Flash team for Apple yesterday and come work with you at Google today. And there are very different cultures there. There are examples of this going quite well. There's a great paper that Jeremy Bernholtz wrote a few years ago, which seems totally out of context in the first one I'm about to tell it to you, but wait, give me a second. It was about summer camps. Summer camps have this very unusual criteria that every year they must essentially remanufacture a culture from scratch, right? With just a small number of people who are overlapping. And I think if you can start to understand the kinds of processes and rituals that allow that to happen, I think you have a much better chance of making someone feel like they can live in your organization today and his tomorrow. People are actually quite good at this. Goffman's talked about it for a number of years. Do you want to add anything to that?
I just add that our research finds that one of the most important things is cultural adaptability. So if you go to Silicon Valley, you'll see that companies are hiring on fit. There's a famous Netflix deck, which is all about our culture, and if you don't fit our kind of die-hard, individualistic culture, don't come in. Our studies suggest that actually what's really important is people's capability to adapt, and if we, in the future, if we get cross-sectional data across people as they travel over time, we'll find whether that is something really that's an attribute inherent to people. Are there people that are more equipped for a changing world whereby you travel across cultures, and the most important feature is your ability to adapt and retool.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here.
So how much of the success of such Flash teams depend on having a shared mental framework? So for example, the retirement video example. I mean, a culture, here, if you've been in the US, you've seen a bunch of retirement parties. But if you've never seen a retirement party, so how much of that shared mental framework is necessary for success? And that would dictate the tasks you can successfully assign to Flash teams.
Sure. So you'd be surprised, actually. A large proportion of the workers on these platforms, such as Upwork, decreasingly Mechanical Turk because they've disallowed international signups, but Upwork and Freelancer and so on, they're international. Software engineers, ton in Russia and in India. Designers, likewise. So you actually run into many interesting cultural problems, but more about teamwork and less about assumptions behind the work is what we've seen so far. In many ways, professional contexts seem to dominate the local cultural context, and it may just be because there's sort of like this dominant expectation in the way that you're hired and the way that the software looks. In fact, what I would predict is the strongest determiner of the results we saw is that actually what a Flash team is doing is it's setting expectations and creating a shared mental model that we all know this is exactly how it's supposed to work. And you can imagine that as you run these teams more and more times, you can essentially produce example inputs and outputs, right? And expectations, for example, about how long it's supposed to take. And that would help a lot in, I think, getting people onto the same page.
Okay. Another
Can you
question?
talk a little bit about incentives? We've learned from economics that a lot of behavior is determined by incentives. So does reputation have a role to play in
Yeah, I think we're going to have different answers here, but it's going to be really interesting. So yeah, so a major challenge with these online crowd marketplaces is reputation. They all suffer from what I call the Yelp problem, which is that everyone's 4.5 stars, which makes it extremely difficult to understand who's good, who's bad, right? And the reason for this is that in any sort of bilateral rating, any like two-sided marketplace like this, there's a social pressure to avoid reciprocity by giving the other person a high rating. You may have seen this. I certainly, when I get out of an Uber, they're like, "You're going to give me 5 stars, right?" Because if they get enough ratings that are below 5 stars, they're out of the system entirely. So that ends up making the reputation system essentially meaningless. We have been thinking quite a lot within my own group about how to create more incentive-compatible reputation systems. So just at the highest level, I'd be happy to chat with you offline, but the insight would be make it such that if I rate someone high, it increases in the system side the probability that that person's going to come back and do work with me again. So that is, if I give someone who's bad a good rating, it's actually going to make it more likely that I'm going to get subpar service again later. So you can start to think about mechanisms like this that can start to pull these things together. But I am also interested not just at the individual level, and I think as we move forward, this thing that starts out with individuals like Uber is just going to grow and grow and grow and move up the knowledge chain stack, sorry. And you have to start asking questions about what happens when groups of 2 or 3 start bonding together covalently and basically jumping around and working on things. Do they get their own reputation? And when something goes wrong, whose fault is it? I think we have a number of really unanswered questions in this space, some of which we can learn from existing traditional organizations and others which we just need to essentially figure out de novo. So it's a really important question we have to face.
Okay.
I agree with you on that.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm done.
That was simple. Dan, I think you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I have to ask about, I'm just curious about the security aspects of this. So, if it's about crunching corporate data, all of a sudden you're sending your private data, corporate data to who knows where around the world. Or if it's about outsourcing software development, all of a sudden you have developers that you've never met before who are developing code for you. Maybe they, put backdoors in it, viruses and so on. So is there, what's the answer to the security problem that you're facing here?
That's a great question. So I can tell you what firms do now, which is not necessarily what it has to be, but it's an interesting point. Many large firms already use crowdsourcing platforms through external vendors to do things like relevance ranking for search or data labeling. And what they often end up doing is working with the vendor, hiring people under NDA, basically. So they become essentially contractors for the organization. and then the company essentially has the same legal leverage they would have anywhere else. This is not great in the sense that like there's still no guarantee, but they do have, the company then does have a group that they consider that they can trust. The other aspect of this would be, I like to put crowds in productive tension with each other. So one thing you can imagine doing is having an entire group whose entire point is to examine each piece of thing that gets produced by a Flash team or by a crowd to basically just try to tear it down. And in fact, we've done that recently where we were creating not just a team, but an entire organization built out of experts from the crowd. And one of the parts of this organization was the software they were building had to be HIPAA compliant. And so we actually took some security engineers, had them go train themselves up on HIPAA rules, and then essentially start attacking the system. It's, again, one way. I feel like at some level, I can't make a precise theoretical guarantee, but at some point, you have to let social norms start playing.
Okay, there's another question?
Yeah, so I have a question. I read quite a bit about how personal relationships within teams actually can improve efficiency and productivity, and it takes time to build those personal relationships. So that seems like it could be a challenge here with Flash teams. I'm wondering how you address that, if it's a different sort of task or kind of a different application. Just curious.
Great question. I mean, this ties to some of your work on cultural adaptivity as well. There are, as Amir's work was showing, I think we are remarkably flexible, and it takes very few cues for us to begin to start teaming, so to speak. The future that I envision is one in which you're not necessarily always being hired as an individual freelancer, but one in which you're actually specifying colleagues who you like to work with. Imagine a sort of LinkedIn or Facebook style network graph that then can be sampled from, such that I'm more likely to work with people who I have a working relationship with. And I think this is a reasonable approximation of what, imagine I'm now sort of superpositioned across multiple agencies, but I think that starts to get some of that stuff to happen. There are also a number of known techniques for trying to build culture quickly. Anything you want to add to this? Yeah.
I'll hazard a prediction here. So I think one of the reasons that personal relationships are so important in organizations is precisely because the engineering process of coordination, like organizational technology, is not well developed. It's a way for us to overcome coordination problems through rapport and mutual trust that emerges. So to the extent that Flash teams will be, I believe, capable in solving some of these coordination problems through developing these maps and these procedures and kind of implicitly coordinating, then relationships won't be as imperative. That said, I would also expect that if this becomes a highly kind of normative way of doing a work, then there will be kind of ecological norms that would emerge. People would know what to expect coming into a project, and that will a priori solve some of the problems that we need to solve ad hoc in an organization. So that's an interesting open question.
I view it as a design problem, something that we can actually start to think about in designing better solutions for.
While we wait for the next question, I have a request. For your next Flash video, could you do an SDSI overview, please?
All right.
So next retreat, we can watch the SDSI overview.
Does that mean I get to request more funding?
Yeah,
Sure.
You can request more funding. Request more funding.
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
If you hope to apply this to really large and complex problems, what are some of the techniques to manage and merge large numbers of contributions where they're not really independent pieces, but they have complex dependencies if we're going to actually come up with a single, coherent, comprehensive solution to a large, complicated problem?
Right. So this is what you're poking at is actually a very deep problem with crowdsourcing, which has been that while we can kludge together many solutions to take people who are very lightly who are working together in very lightweight ways to do complex work, the really complex stuff, even with a Flash team, is still far out of reach. And now I'm gonna talk about very briefly some of the stuff that we're doing now that I think is going to end up being far more transformative in this sense. So all crowdsourcing has essentially been decentrally coordinated. So that means that I can do what I'm supposed to do and he can do what he's supposed to do without us talking. But imagine if crowds could actually be centrally coordinated. That is, there's like, you're in charge, right? And we create a sort of hierarchy where you're actually responsible for understanding what can happen. That allows for the sort of organizational memory to emerge and us to adapt. So you can start to think about metaphors like treating your organization like essentially the source code of what you're trying to do. People within the organization can essentially clone and then issue pull requests to adapt how this organization might work over time. And we can start to think about how to do this rapid onboarding to pull things over, to pull people in, even when there's been a long history of something. Like imagine these things that exist over months or even a year rather than just a day. And I think you start to see a different form of crowd emerging, one that actually looks much more like an organization and much less like a team. And I think that's going to be truly transformational if we can make that happen.
It's really interesting because I think most of us probably imagined that Flash teams were this highly democratic and decentralized thing, but you're describing another version of Flash teams, I don't know, maybe it's Flash Teams 2.0, that's in fact not democratic at all, where they are in fact organized in perhaps a top-down and highly structured way.
Well, in some ways you could think of this as like giving everyone in this room access to run their own organization, right? What would that look like? What would you need in order to make that succeed? What kind of computational infrastructure could empower it?
Okay, so I don't think we have any questions. So just before we break, I just wanted to thank you and say there's a few talks where actually I learned something that I can apply right away. So what did I learn today? That when I lie, I should use long sentences with lots of details.
That's right.
Right? Anyway, that was a joke. Thank you very much.